Admiral Vincent Hayes stood on the observation deck of Orbital Station Perseus, his weathered hands clasped behind his back as he watched the construction crews swarm over the skeletal frame of humanity's newest warship. The ship hung in the black void like a promise and a threat, its incomplete superstructure already dwarfing every other vessel in the shipyard. Even in its unfinished state, the vessel radiated a sense of overwhelming power that made Hayes feel both proud and deeply unsettled. Lieutenant Commander Corinne Morris approached from behind, her footsteps echoing in the observation chamber. She carried a data tablet that glowed softly in the dim light, casting blue shadows across her face. Hayes didn't turn to acknowledge her presence, his eyes still fixed on the massive construction project before them. The construction bay is requesting your approval for the final weapons integration phase, sir. Chief Engineer Sullivan says they're ready to begin mounting the primary batteries. Hayes finally turned from the viewport, his expression thoughtful. He was a tall man with silver hair and the kind of face that had seen too many battles, each one leaving invisible scars that showed only in the depths of his gray eyes. How many ships have we lost in the past 3 years, Corinne? Morris glanced at her tablet, though she already knew the answer. 47 capital ships, sir. Another 112 smaller vessels. The Valorian Collective has been systematically pushing us back across every sector. The Admiral's jaw tightened. And how many crew members? Over 30,000, sir. Morris's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. The latest casualty reports from the Battle of Kepler Station just came in. We lost another 800 personnel when the carrier Lexington went down. Hayes turned back to the viewport, his reflection ghostly against the backdrop of stars and construction lights. Then we proceed. Give Sullivan authorization to continue. I want this ship operational in 6 months. Morris hesitated, her finger hovering over the authorization button on her tablet. Sir, if I may speak freely, there are concerns among the engineering staff about some of the weapon systems. The power requirements alone are unprecedented. Chief Sullivan mentioned that during the initial stress tests, they had to shut down 3 neighboring construction bays because the energy draw was affecting their reactors. The Admiral's expression remained neutral. That's exactly the point, Lieutenant Commander. The Valorians have superior numbers and their technology has been refined over centuries of warfare. They've conquered 70% of known space, and they did it by overwhelming their enemies with sheer firepower and tactical superiority. We can't match them ship for ship, so we need a force multiplier. That ship out there is going to be our answer to their entire battle fleet. Morris studied the incomplete warship through the viewport. Even as they spoke, construction drones were maneuvering massive armor plates into position, each one thick enough to withstand direct hits from conventional plasma cannons. The ship's design was unlike anything in the human fleet, where most warships followed sleek, aerodynamic profiles designed for atmospheric entry. This vessel was purely a space combatant. Its hull was angular and brutal, covered in overlapping ablative armor that could disperse energy weapons fire. Dozens of weapon mounts dotted its surface, waiting for their deadly payloads. What are we calling her, sir? Morris asked quietly. Hayes allowed himself a thin smile. The Liberty. After everything we've lost, everything we're fighting for, it seemed appropriate. 6 months later, the Liberty hung in orbit above Earth like a dark angel of destruction. The ship had been completed ahead of schedule, driven by the urgency of humanity's desperate situation. Captain Douglas Grant stood on the bridge, surrounded by holographic displays that showed every system status, every weapon readout, every crew station throughout the massive vessel. The bridge itself was a marvel of engineering, a spherical command center at the heart of the ship where gravity generators allowed the crew to work on all surfaces. Grant was younger than most captains, only 42, but he'd earned his command through a combination of tactical brilliance and the simple fact that most of his superior officers were dead. He had close-cropped brown hair and sharp features that rarely showed emotion, a necessity when commanding a crew of over 3,000 souls into battle. All stations report ready, Captain. Commander Lisa Porter announced from her position at the tactical console. Her fingers danced across holographic interfaces, pulling up weapons readiness reports. Primary batteries are charged and locked. Secondary systems online. Point defense network active. We're ready for the shakedown cruise. Grant nodded slowly, his eyes scanning the displays. The Liberty's armament was staggering. 24 primary particle beam cannons, each one capable of punching through a kilometer of solid armor. 48 secondary plasma batteries for medium-range engagement. 160-point defense turrets to intercept missiles and fighters. And at the heart of the ship, the weapon that had consumed half the construction budget and pushed human engineering to its absolute limits. A spinal-mounted graviton projector that could literally tear other ships apart at the molecular level. The ship's reactor core was another marvel. Traditional fusion reactors couldn't provide enough power for the Liberty's systems, so human engineers had developed something new. They'd created a controlled singularity, a miniature black hole held in perfect stasis by magnetic fields, drawing energy from its Hawking radiation. The power output was astronomical, enough to run a small city for a century, all channeled into making this single ship the most deadly weapons platform ever conceived. Helm, take us out. Standard departure procedures. Grant's voice was calm, almost casual, but every person on the bridge could feel the weight of the moment. This wasn't just another ship leaving dock. This was humanity's answer to extinction, their defiance made manifest in steel and energy. Ensign Patrick Coleman brought the Liberty's drives online, feeling the ship respond to his commands with surprising grace for something so massive. The vessel was 3 kilometers long, massing more than every other ship in Earth's fleet combined, yet it moved with the precision of a much smaller craft. The Liberty's engines, another revolutionary design, used controlled matter-antimatter reactions that made traditional ion drives look like chemical rockets in comparison. As the Liberty cleared Earth's orbital traffic lanes and accelerated toward the outer system, Grant reviewed the mission parameters. The Valorian Collective had established a forward base in the Arcturus sector, a massive military complex that served as the staging ground for their invasion of human space. Intelligence suggested that over 200 Valorian warships were stationed there, along with supporting infrastructure and supply depots. The previous human strategy had been to avoid direct confrontation, using hit-and-run tactics and hoping to bleed the Valorians through attrition. It hadn't worked. The Collective simply had too many ships, too much industrial capacity. They could absorb losses that would cripple humanity and barely notice. So Admiral Hayes had proposed a different approach. Instead of bleeding them slowly, hit them hard. Show them that humanity could strike back with devastating force. The Liberty's first combat deployment would be a raid on that forward base. Not to destroy it completely, that would require a full fleet, but to demonstrate what the ship could do. To make the Valorians understand that humanity now possessed a weapon that could challenge their dominance. 3 weeks later, the Liberty dropped out of faster-than-light travel at the edge of the Arcturus system. The transition from hyperspace was smooth, the ship's advanced drives barely registering the dimensional shift that would have shaken a conventional vessel. Grant studied the tactical display as sensors began painting a picture of the system. Contact, multiple vessels. Commander Porter's voice was steady despite the tension on the bridge. I'm reading 73 Valorian warships in various orbital positions around the primary station. Classification ranges from destroyers to heavy battlecruisers. Station itself shows heavy defensive armament and shield generators. Grant leaned forward in his command chair. Any indication they've detected us? Not yet, sir. We're still outside their standard sensor range. But once we move in, they'll know we're here. The captain studied the tactical situation. 73 ships. In any conventional engagement, those numbers would be overwhelming. Even with advanced human weaponry, a single ship against that many opponents would be suicide. But the Liberty wasn't a conventional ship. Then let's give them something to notice. Helm, plot an intercept course for the station. Maximum combat speed. Tactical, bring all weapons online and prepare for engagement. The Liberty surged forward, its powerful drives pushing the massive ship to velocities that defied its size. On the Valorian station, Alarms began screaming as sensors detected the approaching vessel. Within minutes, the entire base was on high alert, ships scrambling to defensive positions. Commander Zathros of the Valorian Collective stood in the command center of the orbital station, his scaled skin reflecting the red emergency lighting. The Valorians were a reptilian species, evolved from predators on a high-gravity world, and Zathros exemplified their warrior culture. He'd commanded this forward base for 3 solar cycles, overseeing the systematic conquest of human territory. "Report," Zathros demanded, his voice a hissing growl. A single human vessel approaching at high velocity. His sensor operator's confusion was evident. "But Commander, the size readings must be incorrect. The ship masses more than our entire battle squadron." Zathros moved to the tactical display, studying the approaching contact. Humans didn't build ships that large. Their industrial capacity couldn't support it, yet the sensors weren't malfunctioning. The vessel approaching his station was genuinely massive, far larger than anything in the Collective's database of human ship designs. "Deploy the fleet in defensive formation Alpha. Launch all fighter squadrons. Charge weapons and raise shields. If the humans are foolish enough to attack us with a single ship, no matter how large, we'll turn it into debris." On the Liberty's bridge, Commander Porter watched as the Valorian fleet began maneuvering into defensive positions. 73 ships forming a layered defense around the station, their weapons charging, shield generators cycling to full power. Fighter craft poured from carrier bays, hundreds of small attack vessels swarming like angry insects. "They're deploying standard defensive doctrine," she reported. "Multiple overlapping fields of fire, fighters screen to intercept missiles and provide point defense. They're treating us like a conventional assault." Grant's expression remained neutral. "Range to optimal firing position. 30 seconds at current velocity, sir." The captain took a slow breath, feeling the weight of the moment. Everything humanity had built, all the resources poured into this single ship, all the lives lost that had led to this point, it all came down to the next few minutes. "All batteries prepare to fire on my mark. Point defense systems, autonomous engagement of all hostile fighters. Graviton projector, target the station's primary shield generators." The Liberty crossed into weapons range, and hell erupted in the void. The Valorian fleet opened fire simultaneously, hundreds of plasma cannons and particle beams converging on the human ship. The volume of fire was staggering, enough energy to vaporize a small moon. But the Liberty's shields held advanced barrier technology that could distribute incoming energy across the entire defensive grid. "Fire," Grant commanded. The Liberty's primary batteries spoke as one. 24 particle beams, each one carrying the energy output of a small star, lanced across the void. The nearest Valorian battlecruiser simply ceased to exist, its shields overwhelmed in microseconds, its hull vaporized before the crew could even register the attack. The ship behind it lasted marginally longer, its armor managing to ablate some of the energy before it, too, was reduced to expanding plasma. Secondary batteries engaged, targeting the fighter screen. Plasma bolts filled space with lethal precision, each one guided by targeting computers that could track thousands of objects simultaneously. Valorian fighters exploded in brilliant flashes, their pilots never having a chance to evade or return fire. The Liberty's point defense network added its firepower, creating a sphere of destruction around the ship that nothing could penetrate. And then the graviton projector fired. The weapon had no visible beam, no dramatic energy discharge. What it did was far more terrifying. It projected a localized gravity well, a point in space where gravitational forces increased by orders of magnitude. The effect on the target was catastrophic. The station's shield generators, massive structures designed to withstand conventional weapons fire, simply collapsed in on themselves as if crushed by an invisible hand. Metal twisted and screamed, energy conduits ruptured, and the shields protecting the entire station flickered and died. "Shields down on the primary target," Porter reported, her voice tight with controlled excitement. "Station is vulnerable." Grant watched the tactical display as the Valorian fleet tried to reorganize. They were good, he'd give them that. Despite losing a dozen ships in the first exchange, they were adapting, trying to concentrate their fire on specific points of the Liberty's shields, looking for weaknesses. But the human ship's defenses were too strong, its firepower too overwhelming. Concentrate fire on the station's command section. Let's send them a message. The Liberty's guns spoke again, and the Valorian station's command tower vanished in a sphere of incandescent fury. Secondary explosions rippled through the structure as ammunition stores and fuel reserves ignited. The station, a massive construct that had taken years to build and had been thought impregnable, was dying. Commander Zathros died without understanding what had happened. One moment he was coordinating the defense, the next there was a flash of light and then nothing. The command center and everyone in it simply ceased to exist, vaporized by weapons that shouldn't exist, wielded by a species that was supposed to be on the verge of extinction. The battle, if it could be called that, lasted 17 minutes. When it was over, the Valorian forward base was a shattered ruin, barely recognizable as the formidable military installation it had been. 41 Valorian warships had been destroyed outright. Another 18 were crippled and venting atmosphere, their crews dead or dying. The remaining vessels had broken formation and scattered, fleeing into hyperspace to carry word of what they'd witnessed. The Liberty hung in the debris field, its shields still at 93%, its weapon systems barely warm. Not a single member of the crew had been injured. The ship had suffered minor ablative armor damage in a few sections, easily repaired. They had struck the Valorian collective and emerged unscathed. Grant stood from his command chair, surveying the bridge crew. Every face showed a mixture of shock and pride. They'd known the Liberty was powerful, but seeing it in action, witnessing what it could do, that was something else entirely. Helm, set course for home. We've accomplished our mission. As the Liberty turned toward Earth, leaving the wreckage of the Valorian base behind, no one on the bridge spoke. They didn't need to. They all understood that something fundamental had changed. Humanity was no longer the prey, desperately running from superior predators. They had become hunters in their own right. News of the Liberty's victory spread through human space like wildfire. After years of defeats and retreats, humanity finally had something to celebrate. The ship became a symbol of hope, proof that they could fight back against the collective. Admiral Hayes authorized the construction of 3 more Liberty-class vessels, though everyone knew it would take years to complete them. But the victory had also sent shockwaves through the Valorian collective and beyond. For the first time in their long history of conquest, the Valorians had encountered a weapon they couldn't counter. The Liberty wasn't just a powerful ship. It represented a fundamental shift in the balance of power, and that terrified species who had grown comfortable with their military superiority. 3 months after the Arcturus raid, the Liberty was conducting patrols along the border between human and Valorian space when sensors detected an unusual contact. Not a military vessel, but a diplomatic courier displaying neutral transponder codes. Captain Grant ordered the ship to yellow alert as the courier approached. "They're broadcasting on all frequencies," Commander Porter reported. "Official diplomatic protocols. They're requesting a meeting with senior command authority to discuss a matter of galactic importance." Grant frowned. "Galactic importance? The Valorians want to negotiate." Porter shook her head. "Sir, the courier isn't from the Valorian collective. According to their identification codes, they represent the Galactic Council." That got Grant's attention. The Galactic Council was a loose confederation of older spacefaring species, races that had achieved interstellar travel millennia before humanity even discovered fire. They generally stayed out of conflicts between younger species, maintaining a position of studied neutrality. For them to send a diplomatic mission was unprecedented. Grant authorized the meeting, though he kept the Liberty on high alert. The courier docked with the battleship, and its sole occupant was escorted to a conference room where Grant and several senior officers waited. The alien was a Thessarian, a species known for their diplomatic skills and long lifespans. Ambassador Kelvin, as he introduced himself, was tall and willowy with iridescent skin that shifted colors as he moved. "Captain Grant," the ambassador began, his voice surprisingly deep for such a slender frame. "I come bearing a message from the Galactic Council. We wish to discuss your ship, the Liberty, and the weapons technology it represents." Grant exchanged glances with Commander Porter before responding. "I'm listening, Ambassador." Kelvin settled into a chair, his movements graceful despite the artificial gravity. "The Council has been monitoring the conflict between your species and the Valorian Collective with interest. When news reached us of your attack on the Arcturus base, we investigated the reports. What we found has caused considerable concern among the elder races." Concern? Grant's tone was carefully neutral. "We defended ourselves against an aggressive enemy. I would think the Council would approve of that." The ambassador's skin flickered from blue to purple, a sign of discomfort. "Captain, the Liberty destroyed 41 warships and disabled 18 more in 17 minutes. Your ship suffered negligible damage. That level of combat superiority is unprecedented in modern galactic history. It disrupts the balance of power that has maintained relative stability for thousands of years." Porter leaned forward. "With respect, Ambassador, the Valorians have been disrupting the balance of power for decades. They've conquered hundreds of systems, subjugated dozens of species. Where was the Council when humanity needed help?" Kelvin's colors shifted again, this time to a muted gray. "The Council operates on principles of non-interference in conflicts between younger races. The Valorian Collective, while aggressive, operates within established parameters. They conquer, yes, but they do not exterminate. They integrate conquered species into their empire. This is acceptable under galactic law." Grant felt anger rising in his chest. "Acceptable? They've killed 30,000 humans in the past 3 years. They've destroyed our colonies, enslaved our people. And you call that acceptable?" The ambassador raised a slender hand. "I understand your anger, Captain, truly I do. But from the Council's perspective, your response is disproportionate. The Liberty represents a weapon of such overwhelming power that it could destabilize the entire galactic order. If humanity can build one such ship, you can build more. If you can build more, other species will seek to match your capability. We could be looking at an arms race that ends in catastrophic warfare on a scale the galaxy hasn't seen in millions of years." Grant stared at the Thessarian, unable to believe what he was hearing. "So you want us to what? Dismantle the Liberty? Stop defending ourselves?" Kelvin's skin returned to a neutral blue. "The Council will be convening in 3 standard months to discuss this matter formally. We are proposing a treaty that would ban the construction and deployment of super weapons like the Liberty. All signatory species would be prohibited from building vessels that exceed certain power thresholds. The treaty would be enforced by Council peacekeeping forces." "And the Valorians?" Porter asked. "Would they sign this treaty? They have already indicated their willingness to do so, as have 17 other spacefaring species. The Council believes that with enough signatories, we can create a framework for peaceful coexistence without the threat of weapons of mass destruction." Grant shook his head slowly. "You want us to give up the only advantage we have against an enemy that won't stop until they've conquered all of human space. You want us to trust in galactic law and Council enforcement when that same law allowed the Valorians to attack us in the first place." Kelvin stood, preparing to leave. "I understand your reluctance, Captain, but consider this. The Liberty may give you an advantage now, but how long before the Valorians develop countermeasures? How long before they build their own super weapons? The arms race has already begun. The question is whether we allow it to continue until the galaxy burns or whether we step back from the brink while we still can." The ambassador departed, leaving Grant and his officers in stunned silence. Finally, Porter spoke. "They're afraid of us. For the first time in galactic history, humanity has them scared." Grant nodded slowly. "Fear can be useful, but it can also make people dangerous. Get me a direct line to Admiral Hayes. He needs to hear about this." Over the following months, the debate over the Liberty consumed human space. The Galactic Council's proposed treaty became public knowledge, sparking fierce arguments about humanity's future. Some argued that signing the treaty was the responsible thing to do, that it would bring humanity into the galactic community as a respected member. Others insisted that the treaty was a trap, designed to neutralize humanity's advantage and leave them vulnerable to Valorian aggression. Admiral Hayes found himself at the center of the storm. As the architect of the Liberty Project, he bore responsibility for creating the crisis. He spent long hours in conference rooms and communication centers, debating with politicians, military leaders, and civilian advocacy groups. Everyone wanted to know what he thought humanity should do. Lieutenant Commander Morris sat across from Hayes in his private office aboard orbital station Perseus. The admiral looked older than he had 6 months ago, the weight of the decision wearing on him visibly. She'd brought him the latest intelligence reports, including analysis of Valorian ship movements since the Arcturus battle. They've pulled back across every front, Morris reported, reduced their patrols by 40%. Intelligence suggests they're consolidating their forces, preparing for a major engagement. Hayes studied the data. They're afraid to engage the Liberty directly. So they're building up strength, waiting to see if we sign the treaty or if they need to find another solution. Sir, if I may ask, what are you going to recommend to the Council of Governors? The Admiral was quiet for a long moment, staring out his viewport at the stars. I've been asking myself that question every day. The Liberty was supposed to save humanity. Now it might be the thing that gets us outlawed by the entire galaxy. Morris waited, knowing Hayes needed to work through his thoughts aloud. Do you think the treaty is genuine, sir? Or is it a ploy to disarm us? Hayes turned from the viewport. I think it's both. The Council genuinely fears an arms race, that much is clear. But they also see an opportunity to contain humanity before we become too powerful. The Valorians are willing to sign because they know they can rebuild their conventional forces faster than we can match the Liberty's capabilities. Even if we complete the other 3 ships under construction, we'll have 4 super weapons against their hundreds of standard warships. The math doesn't favor us in a prolonged conflict. So what do? The Admiral's expression hardened. We use the time we have. The treaty won't be finalized for another 2 months. In that time, the Liberty conducts maximum pressure operations. We hit every Valorian position we can reach, demonstrate our capability so thoroughly that the collective understands the cost of continued aggression. Then when the treaty is signed, we have leverage. The Valorians will be too afraid to attack us openly, and we'll have breathing room to build up our conventional forces. You're planning to sign the treaty. Morris couldn't hide her surprise. Hayes nodded slowly. I built the Liberty to save humanity, not to start a galactic war. If the Council is offering a path to peace, even a flawed one, we have to consider it. But we'll do it from a position of strength, not weakness. The following 2 months saw the Liberty unleashed across Valorian space like a force of nature. Captain Grant and his crew struck supply lines, destroyed orbital facilities, and shattered Valorian battle groups with ruthless efficiency. Each engagement followed the same pattern. The Liberty would emerge from hyperspace, its sensors identifying targets, its weapons reducing them to scrap, and then it would vanish before reinforcements could arrive. The Valorians tried everything to stop the human battleship. They laid ambushes with overwhelming numbers of ships. They deployed experimental weapons designed to penetrate advanced shields. They even attempted boarding actions, sending special forces teams against the Liberty in suicide missions. Nothing worked. The ship was simply too powerful, too well designed, too far ahead of anything the collective could field. By the time the Galactic Council convened to finalize the treaty, the Valorian collective had lost over 300 ships to the Liberty's rampage. Their forward momentum had been completely halted. Territory they'd conquered over the past 5 years was suddenly vulnerable, their supply lines cut, their military strength shattered. The treaty signing took place on neutral ground, a massive space station maintained by the Council in the galactic core. Representatives from 47 species gathered to witness the historic moment. Humanity's delegation was led by Admiral Hayes himself, accompanied by Captain Grant and several other senior military officers. The Valorian representative was Supreme Commander Krell, the highest-ranking military officer in the collective. He stood nearly 3 meters tall, his scaled hide bearing scars from a lifetime of warfare. When Hayes entered the diplomatic chamber, Krell's eyes tracked him with obvious hostility, but also something else: respect, and perhaps a hint of fear. The treaty itself was complex, filling hundreds of pages with technical specifications and legal language, but the core provisions were simple. No signatory species would build or deploy vessels exceeding specific power thresholds. Existing superweapons, specifically including the Liberty, would be decommissioned within one standard year. The Galactic Council would maintain enforcement rights, with peacekeeping forces authorized to intervene if the treaty was violated. In exchange, all signatory species agreed to a framework for peaceful resolution of disputes. The Valorian Collective would halt their expansion and enter into negotiations regarding territories conquered in the past decade. Reparations would be paid to affected species, including humanity. It wasn't everything Hayes wanted, but it was something. It was a chance for peace. Before the signing ceremony began, Supreme Commander Krell approached Hayes privately. The Valorian warrior towered over the human admiral, but Hayes stood his ground, meeting the alien's gaze steadily. "Your ship has cost the Collective dearly, Admiral." Krell's voice was a low rumble like distant thunder. "My 5 decades of military service, I have never encountered a weapon I could not counter, until now." Hayes kept his expression neutral. "I take no pleasure in the deaths of your warriors, Commander. I built the Liberty to defend my species, nothing more." Krell's eyes narrowed. "You built a weapon that could have conquered the galaxy. Do you understand that? With a fleet of ships like the Liberty, humanity could have done to us what we attempted to do to you. Yet you choose to sign this treaty instead. Why?" "Because conquest was never our goal," Hayes replied quietly. "We wanted to survive. Now we want to build something better than an empire built on fear and subjugation. The Liberty proved we can defend ourselves. This treaty proves we can do more than just survive." The Valorian commander was silent for a long moment. "You are either very wise, Admiral, or very foolish. Time will tell which, but know this. The Collective respects strength. You have shown us strength. That will not be forgotten." The treaty was signed with great ceremony. Representatives from dozens of species added their marks to the historic document, committing their civilizations to a new era of controlled armament and peaceful dispute resolution. When Hayes signed on behalf of humanity, he felt the weight of every decision that had led to this moment. The lives lost in the war with the Valorians, the resources poured into the Liberty Project, the risk of galactic isolation if humanity had refused to sign. 1 year later, Captain Grant stood on the bridge of the Liberty for the final time. The ship hung in orbit above Earth, surrounded by engineering vessels and observation platforms. Hundreds of civilian ships had gathered to witness the decommissioning, their crews wanting to see the legendary warship one last time before it was dismantled. The crew had been reduced to a skeleton staff, just enough personnel to maintain basic systems during the shutdown procedures. Commander Porter stood beside Grant, her expression somber. "It feels wrong, sir. After everything this ship accomplished, to just tear it apart." Grant understood her feelings. He'd commanded the Liberty through its greatest battles, seen what it could do, felt the pride of serving aboard the most powerful warship ever built. But he also understood the larger picture. The Liberty was a weapon, and weapons shaped the conflicts they were designed to fight. By giving up the ship, humanity was choosing a different path. "This ship was never meant to last forever, Commander. It was meant to buy us time, to show the galaxy that humanity couldn't be pushed around. We did that. Now it's time to build something else." The shutdown began with the primary weapons systems. The particle beam cannons were powered down, their massive capacitors drained of energy. The graviton projector, the weapon that had terrorized the Valorian Collective, was carefully dismantled, its exotic components catalogued and placed in secure storage. The treaty allowed humanity to maintain the technical knowledge of super weapons, just not to deploy them. As systems went offline one by one, Grant walked through the ship's corridors, remembering the panic during their first engagement when the Valorian fleet had opened fire, and for a brief moment everyone thought the shields might fail. The triumph of watching enemy ships explode under the Liberty's guns. The camaraderie of a crew that knew they were part of something historic. Admiral Hayes watched the decommissioning from orbital station Perseus, surrounded by the same staff that had overseen the Liberty's construction. Lieutenant Commander Morris stood beside him, now promoted to full commander and serving as his chief of staff. Together they watched as the great warship's lights dimmed, section by section, until only minimal power remained. "Do you regret it, sir?" Morris asked quietly, building the Liberty knowing it would lead to this. Hayes was quiet for a long moment, watching as engineering crews began the process of physically dismantling the ship's superstructure. "No, I don't regret it. Without the Liberty, humanity would have been conquered by now. We'd be subjects of the Valorian collective, our culture erased, our people scattered across their empire. Instead, we're sitting at the table with the Council species as equals. That's worth more than any weapon." The dismantling of the Liberty took 6 months. The ship was carefully taken apart, its components either destroyed per treaty requirements or stored in secure facilities. The revolutionary reactor core was shut down, and its containment fields collapsed in a controlled process that took weeks of careful preparation. The graviton projector was disassembled into its constituent parts, the knowledge of how to build it preserved, but the weapon itself rendered inoperable. But the Liberty's legacy lived on in other ways. The ship's existence had fundamentally altered galactic politics. The Valorian collective, humbled by their defeats, had become more cautious in their dealings with other species. Several worlds they'd conquered were returned to independence as part of the peace negotiations. The balance of power had shifted, and while humanity had given up their super weapon, they'd gained something more valuable. They'd gained respect. The technical knowledge gained from the Liberty Project revolutionized human shipbuilding. While they couldn't build super weapons anymore, they could build better conventional warships. The next generation of human vessels incorporated improved reactor designs, stronger shields, and more efficient weapon systems. Within 5 years, humanity's fleet was the most technologically advanced in the sector, respected by allies and feared by potential enemies. Captain Grant was promoted to Rear Admiral and given command of humanity's border defense fleet. He built a reputation as a brilliant tactician, someone who could win battles through strategy rather than overwhelming firepower. Many of the Liberty's crew served under him, bringing their experience to new ships and new crews. Admiral Hayes retired from active service 5 years after the treaty signing, though he remained an advisor to the government on military and diplomatic matters. He lived long enough to see humanity establish peaceful trade relations with the Valorian collective, a development that would have seemed impossible during the war years. On his deathbed, surrounded by family and old comrades, his last words were about the Liberty. "We built it to save ourselves. Instead, it saved the galaxy from an arms race that would have destroyed us all. I'm proud of that." Decades later, when historians wrote about the Great Transition, the period when humanity emerged as a major galactic power, they always spent considerable time discussing the Liberty. The ship had existed for barely 2 years, from its launch to its final decommissioning, yet its impact on galactic history was immeasurable. Some argued that humanity had made a mistake in signing the treaty, that they should have used the Liberty to establish dominance while they had the chance. Others pointed out that such a path would have led to endless warfare, with humanity becoming the very thing they'd fought against. The truth, as always, was more complex. The Liberty had been necessary. Without it, humanity would have been conquered or destroyed. But it had also been a transitional technology, a bridge between humanity's desperate fight for survival and their emergence as a respected member of the galactic community. The ship had served its purpose not through endless war, but by making war unnecessary. The Liberty's greatest victory wasn't any battle it fought. It was the peace it made possible. The ship had been so overpowered that the galaxy had no choice but to outlaw it, and in doing so, the galaxy had created a framework for preventing such weapons in the future. The treaty that bore the Liberty's mark ensured that no species could threaten galactic stability with super weapons, creating a more level playing field for all spacefaring civilizations. The years following the treaty brought unprecedented changes to human society. The military-industrial complex that had supported the Liberty Project was gradually transformed. Engineers who had worked on advanced weapons systems found new purpose in civilian applications. The controlled singularity technology that had powered the Liberty was adapted for use in deep space exploration vessels, allowing humanity to push further into uncharted regions of the galaxy than ever before. Commander Porter, now Admiral Porter in her own right, stood before a class of young cadets at the Earth Fleet Academy. She was older now, her hair streaked with gray, but her eyes still held the same sharp intelligence that had made her such an effective tactical officer aboard the Liberty. The cadets listened with rapt attention as she described the ship's final battle, the engagement at Valorius Prime, where the Liberty had faced down an entire collective task force and emerged victorious. But the lesson you need to understand isn't about the Liberty's firepower, she told them, her voice carrying through the lecture hall. It's about knowing when to use that power and when to choose a different path. Captain Grant could have taken that ship and conquered half the known galaxy. The Valorians certainly expected us to try, but we chose peace instead because we understood something they didn't. True strength isn't about how much you can destroy. It's about what you choose to build. A young cadet raised her hand, her expression troubled. Admiral, don't you think we were foolish to give up such an advantage? What if the Valorians had refused to honor the treaty? What if they'd used the time to build something even more powerful than the Liberty? Porter smiled, recognizing the same questions that had plagued her own mind decades ago. Those are valid concerns, Cadet. And yes, we took a risk. But consider this. In the 5 years the Liberty was operational, we destroyed over 800 Valorian vessels. We broke their military supremacy and forced them to negotiate. But in the 20 years since the treaty, we've built a fleet of 3,000 advanced warships, established colonies on 100 worlds, and formed alliances with 17 other species. Which outcome serves humanity better? A single unstoppable weapon, or a thriving civilization that's respected throughout the galaxy? Cadet nodded slowly, understanding beginning to dawn in her eyes. Porter continued, her voice taking on a more reflective tone. The Liberty taught us an important lesson about power. Having the biggest weapon doesn't guarantee victory. Sometimes it just guarantees that everyone else will unite against you. The Galactic Council wasn't wrong to fear what the Liberty represented. An arms race of super weapons would have devastated the galaxy. By agreeing to the treaty, we prevented that catastrophe. Meanwhile, in the distant reaches of Valorian space, Supreme Commander Krell sat in his private chambers aboard the battle station that served as the collective's military headquarters. He was much older now, his scales dulled with age, but his mind remained sharp. On his desk sat a holographic projector displaying tactical data from the Liberty's engagements. Even after all these years, he still studied those battles, trying to understand how humanity had achieved such overwhelming superiority. A young officer entered the chamber, bowing respectfully. Supreme Commander, the new patrol schedules require your approval. The border regions with human space need reinforcement. Krell waved the data pad away without looking at it. Tell me, Junior Commander, what do you know of the Liberty? The young officer seemed surprised by the question. The human super weapon, sir. It was decommissioned years ago under the treaty. Ancient history. Krell's eyes narrowed. Ancient history. That ship changed the course of galactic civilization, and you dismiss it as ancient history. The Liberty humbled the collective in ways I never thought possible. It forced us to recognize that we weren't the supreme military power we believed ourselves to be. The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. Forgive me, Supreme Commander. I meant no disrespect. But the humans agreed to dismantle the ship. Doesn't that prove our superiority? They bowed to the will of the Council. Krell stood, moving to the viewport that looked out over the vast expanse of space. You misunderstand, Junior Commander. The humans didn't bow to anyone. They made a strategic choice that served their interests better than continued warfare would have. They traded one super weapon for galactic legitimacy, for trade agreements, for alliances, for peace. In doing so, they gained far more than they lost. That's the lesson the Liberty teaches. Power without wisdom is meaningless. The humans showed us wisdom. Back on Earth, in the archives beneath the Fleet Academy, A team of historians worked diligently to preserve every detail of the Liberty's brief but spectacular career. Dr. Helen Martinez led the project, a civilian researcher who had made the study of the Liberty era her life's work. She sat surrounded by data cores, holographic displays, and physical artifacts recovered from the ship before its final dismantling. Among the artifacts was Captain Grant's personal log, a detailed record of every decision made aboard the Liberty during its operational period. Martinez had read through it dozens of times, but each reading revealed new insights into the mindset of the man who had commanded humanity's ultimate weapon. One entry in particular always caught her attention, dated 3 days before the treaty signing. The log entry read, "We've received word that the Council has finalized the treaty terms. The Liberty will be decommissioned within the year. Part of me feels like we're surrendering, giving up the one advantage that kept humanity safe. But Admiral Hayes reminded me today that the Liberty was always meant to be temporary. It was a shield, not a sword. It protected us long enough to find a better way forward. I think he's right. This ship represents the best and worst of what we can be. The best because we built something revolutionary to protect what we love. The worst because we built it to destroy. Maybe it's time to focus on building things that don't require destruction." Martinez smiled as she read the words again. Grant had understood something profound about the Liberty. The ship wasn't an end in itself. It was a means to an end. And once that end was achieved, holding onto the weapon out of pride or fear would have been counterproductive. She made a note to include that log entry prominently in her upcoming book on the Liberty era. The galactic community continued to evolve in the decades following the treaty. New species were discovered, some of which joined the Council framework willingly, others who needed persuasion. The treaty that had banned superweapons became a cornerstone of galactic law, cited in countless diplomatic negotiations and legal proceedings. Enforcement fell to a special Council task force, equipped with advanced sensors capable of detecting the energy signatures of prohibited weapon systems. There were occasional violations, of course. A rogue species here, an ambitious warlord there, attempting to circumvent the treaty restrictions. But the Council responded swiftly and decisively to such challenges, deploying peacekeeping forces to neutralize the threats before they could destabilize the galactic order. The precedent set by the Liberty's decommissioning gave the Council moral authority that no amount of military force could have provided. 50 years after the Liberty's final voyage, a delegation from a newly discovered species arrived at Earth seeking membership in the human-led Trade Confederation. The Zalarian ambassador, a being composed of energy patterns held together by a containment field, expressed confusion about humanity's reverence for a weapon that had been destroyed decades ago. The human diplomatic representative, a descendant of one of the Liberty's original crew members, smiled at the question. "We don't revere the Liberty because it was a weapon, ambassador. We revere it because it represents a choice. Humanity stood at a crossroads. We could have used that ship to become conquerors, to impose our will on the galaxy through force. Instead, we chose cooperation. We chose to build a civilization based on mutual respect rather than fear. The Liberty gave us the power to make that choice. That's why we remember it." The Zalarian ambassador's energy patterns flickered in a way that suggested contemplation. "Your species is young by galactic standards, yet you display wisdom that some elder races lack. Perhaps this is why you have risen so quickly to prominence." The diplomat nodded. "We learned our lessons the hard way, through war and loss. The Liberty was born from desperation, but it taught us that desperation doesn't have to lead to destruction. It can lead to innovation, to change, to growth. We hope that other species can learn from our example without having to go through the same painful experiences." In the halls of the Galactic Council, the Liberty's legacy continued to influence policy decisions. When debates arose about military limitations or weapons development, Council members would inevitably reference the treaty that had emerged from humanity's superweapon. The ship had become a case study in how to manage destabilizing technologies, a template for preventing arms races before they could spiral out of control. Ambassador Kelvin, the the Thessarian who had first approached humanity about the treaty, lived long enough to see his diplomatic achievement validated. In his final years, he wrote a memoir detailing the negotiations that had led to the treaty. One chapter focused entirely on his conversations with Admiral Hayes, the human who had built the Liberty and then agreed to dismantle it. Kelvin wrote, "I have dealt with hundreds of species over my long career, negotiated countless treaties, prevented numerous conflicts, but I have never met anyone quite like Admiral Vincent Hayes. He understood something that most military leaders struggle to grasp. He understood that the purpose of strength is not to dominate, but to create space for something better. The Liberty could have conquered the galaxy, but Hayes used it to buy time for peace. That takes a special kind of courage, the courage to give up power voluntarily." The memoir became required reading for diplomatic students throughout the galaxy, studied alongside ancient Earth texts on statecraft and modern analyses of interspecies relations. Hayes became a figure of almost mythological importance, the admiral who built a weapon to save his species and then gave it up to save the galaxy. 100 years after the Liberty's decommissioning, a monument was erected at the shipyard where it had been built. The memorial showed the ship in its full glory, a reminder of what humanity had accomplished and what they'd chosen to give up. Beneath the statue were the names of every crew member who had served aboard the Liberty, a roster of men and women who had piloted the most powerful warship in galactic history. The dedication ceremony drew dignitaries from across the galaxy. Species that had once feared the Liberty now sent representatives to honor its memory. The Valorian Collective dispatched a full military honor guard, their presence a testament to how much had changed in the century since the ship's operational days. Supreme Commander Krell, long since retired but still influential in Valorian society, attended personally despite his advanced age. The ceremony began with a traditional human military processional, followed by representatives from each signatory species of the original treaty. As each speaker took the podium, they shared their perspectives on how the Liberty had changed their civilizations. The Thessarian ambassador spoke of diplomatic breakthroughs that had only been possible because of the precedent the treaty set. A Kilovian scientist discussed how the research collaboration that followed the treaty had advanced galactic understanding of physics and energy systems. But it was when the Valorian honor guard stepped forward that the crowd fell into absolute silence. The lead warrior, a decorated veteran who had fought in the campaigns against human space, approached the monument with slow, deliberate steps. In his clawed hands, he carried a ceremonial weapon, an ancient Valorian sword that had been passed down through generations of warriors. The warrior knelt before the monument, placing the sword at its base. "This blade has been carried by Valorian commanders for 12 generations," he said, his voice carrying the weight of tradition and respect. "It has seen countless battles, countless victories. Today we lay it here as a symbol of our acknowledgement. The Liberty defeated us not just in battle but in vision. You showed us that there were paths other than conquest, futures other than domination. For this lesson, delivered at the edge of annihilation, we are grateful." The gesture sent ripples through the diplomatic community. For the Valorians, a warrior culture that prized military strength above all else, to acknowledge defeat so publicly and to honor those who had defeated them was unprecedented. It spoke to how profoundly the Liberty had changed galactic politics, how it had forced even the most militaristic species to reconsider their fundamental assumptions about power and conquest. Standing before the monument, Krell addressed the assembled crowd, his voice amplified so that all could hear. 100 years ago, this ship terrified the Valorian Collective. We had never encountered a weapon we could not defeat, a challenge we could not overcome through force. The Liberty showed us our limitations, but more importantly, it showed us an alternative to endless warfare. The humans could have used this ship to destroy us. Instead, they used it to force us to negotiate, to find common ground, to build a lasting peace. For that wisdom, the Valorian Collective will be eternally grateful. The crowd erupted in applause, a sound that echoed across the shipyard where the Liberty had first taken shape. Among the attendees was Admiral Grant's granddaughter, a young woman who had followed her grandfather's footsteps into military service. She stood in her dress uniform, tears streaming down her face as she listened to former enemies praise the ship her grandfather had commanded. Later that evening, after the official ceremonies had concluded, a private gathering was held for the surviving crew members of the Liberty and their families. The group was small now, time having claimed most of those who had served aboard the great ship. But those who remained shared their memories, their stories, their reflections on what the Liberty had meant to them and to humanity. Ensign Patrick Coleman, now in his 80s but still sharp-minded, spoke about his experiences as the Liberty's helmsman. "I remember the first time we engaged the main drives at full power," he said, his eyes distant with memory. "The ship responded like it was alive, like it wanted to move. We'd trained on simulators, of course, but nothing could have prepared us for the real thing. When Captain Grant gave the order to accelerate to combat speed, and I pushed those controls forward, I felt the power of the entire ship responding to my touch. It was terrifying and exhilarating in equal measure." Another veteran, Chief Engineer Bobby Sullivan, nodded in agreement. The reactor core was a marvel, but it was also the most dangerous thing any of us had ever worked with. We were containing a miniature black hole in magnetic fields, drawing power from its radiation. One mistake, one miscalculation, and the entire ship could have been lost. But we trusted the design, trusted each other, and it never failed us. Not once in 2 years of operation did that reactor give us a critical problem. The conversation turned to the battles they'd fought, the victories they'd achieved, and the lives that had been saved because of the Liberty's intervention. Each veteran had their own perspective, their own memories of what it had been like to serve aboard the most powerful warship in galactic history. But they all agreed on one thing. The hardest part hadn't been fighting. It had been accepting that their ship would be dismantled, that all they'd accomplished would become history. "I thought Captain Grant was making a mistake," Coleman admitted quietly. "When he told us about the treaty, about the decommissioning, I was angry. We had this incredible ship, we were winning, and we were just going to give it all up. It didn't make sense to me then. But looking back now, seeing what humanity has become, the alliances we've built, the peace we've maintained, I understand. The Liberty was a tool, and like any tool, it served its purpose, and then it was time to set it aside." Sullivan raised his glass in a toast. "To the Liberty, and to all who served aboard her. May we never need another ship like her, but may we never forget the lessons she taught us." The gathered veterans echoed the toast, their voices blending in a moment of shared memory and mutual respect. They were old now, their fighting days long behind them, but they had been part of something extraordinary. They had crewed the ship that changed the galaxy, and that was something no amount of time could diminish. In the academic halls of universities across human space and beyond, the Liberty remained a subject of intense study and debate. Military strategists analyzed its tactical deployments, seeking to understand how a single ship had achieved such dominance. Engineers studied the technical specifications that had survived the ship's dismantling, marveling at the innovations that had made it possible. Philosophers and ethicists debated the moral implications of building such a weapon and the wisdom of giving it up. Professor Andrew Walsh of the New Cambridge Strategic Studies Institute had made the Liberty his primary research focus. His comprehensive analysis of the ship's impact on galactic politics had become the definitive academic work on the subject. In his lectures, he would often pose a thought experiment to his students. "Imagine you're Admiral Hayes," he would say. "You've built the ultimate weapon. Your enemies fear you. Your allies respect you. You have the power to reshape the galaxy. Do you hold on to that power, or do you voluntarily give it up?" The students would debate the question passionately, some arguing for retaining the Liberty as a deterrent, others advocating for its decommissioning to prevent an arms race. Walsh would listen to all sides before revealing the historical truth. Admiral Hayes chose to give it up. He would explain, not because he was weak, but because he understood that true security doesn't come from having the biggest weapon. It comes from being part of a stable system where all parties have incentives to maintain peace. The Liberty could have given humanity temporary dominance, but it would have created permanent instability. Hayes chose the harder path, the path that required faith in diplomacy and international cooperation. The debates weren't confined to academic institutions. In military command centers, fleet officers studied the Liberty's operational history as part of their advanced tactical training. They learned not just how the ship had fought, but why certain decisions had been made, how Captain Grant had balanced overwhelming firepower with strategic restraint, how the crew had maintained discipline and focus even when wielding godlike power. Lieutenant Commander Rachel Norton, who taught advanced tactics at the Fleet Academy, would often use the Battle of Arcturus as a case study. "Look at the numbers," she would tell her students, displaying tactical data on holographic screens. 73 enemy vessels against 1. In any conventional analysis, those odds would be suicide. But the Liberty wasn't conventional. Watch how Captain Grant deployed his ship. The holographic display would show the Liberty's approach, its devastating first volley, the precise targeting that eliminated the greatest threats first. Notice, Norton would continue, that Grant didn't try to destroy all 73 ships. He could have. The Liberty had the firepower, but that would have been wasteful and would have prolonged the engagement. Instead, he targeted the command structure, the shield generators, the units that posed the greatest threat. He achieved his objective, crippling the base and breaking the enemy formation, with minimum expenditure of resources. That's the mark of a master tactician. The lessons drawn from the Liberty's operations extended far beyond pure military tactics. Business schools studied the ship as a case study in resource allocation and strategic planning. The Liberty project had consumed enormous resources, required breakthrough innovations in multiple fields, and carried tremendous risks. Yet it had succeeded beyond all expectations, delivering strategic value that far exceeded its material cost. Meanwhile, in the laboratories and research facilities scattered across human space, engineers continued to push the boundaries of what was possible, always mindful of the treaty restrictions but constantly innovating. The technology that had made the Liberty possible, controlled singularities, advanced particle physics, graviton manipulation, found new applications in civilian and peaceful military contexts. Ships couldn't be built with Liberty-class firepower, but they could be faster, more efficient, better protected. Dr. Sarah Kim, who had worked on the Liberty's shield systems as a young engineer, now led a team developing advanced defensive technologies for merchant vessels operating in dangerous regions of space. "The principles we developed for the Liberty's shields," she explained in a documentary about the ship's legacy, "revolutionized our understanding of energy dispersal and field generation. We can't build military shields as powerful as what the Liberty had, but we can make civilian ships much safer than they would otherwise be. That's a worthwhile application of the knowledge we gained." After the ceremony, she approached the monument alone, running her fingers over the engraved names. She found her grandfather's name near the top of the list, right below Admiral Hayes. For a moment she could almost imagine what it must have been like, standing on the Liberty's bridge, commanding such incredible power, knowing that every decision could determine the fate of humanity. A voice spoke from behind her. "He was a good man, your grandfather, remarkable captain." She turned to find Admiral Porter, now ancient and supported by medical assistants but still sharp-eyed and commanding. "Admiral Porter," the young woman said, snapping to attention. "I didn't expect to see you here, ma'am." Porter waved away the formality. "I wouldn't miss this for anything. The Liberty was the most important ship I ever served on, even if our time together was brief. Your grandfather understood something that many officers never learn. He understood that command isn't about giving orders. It's about making choices that you'll have to live with for the rest of your life." The young officer hesitated, then asked the question that had been bothering her. "Admiral, do you think we made the right choice? Giving up the Liberty, I mean. What if we need something like it again?" Porter smiled, the expression weathered but warm. "If we need something like the Liberty again, we'll build it. That's the real lesson the ship taught us. Not that we should never build weapons, but that we should only build them when absolutely necessary, and we should be willing to give them up when they're no longer needed. The knowledge that built the Liberty still exists. The engineers who designed it passed their expertise to the next generation. If humanity faces an existential threat again, we have the capability to respond. But we also have the wisdom to know that living in a constant state of maximum military readiness isn't sustainable. It's not healthy for a civilization. The old admiral gazed up at the monument, her eyes distant with memory. You know what your grandfather told me, right before we signed the decommissioning order. He said that the Liberty was the most beautiful and most terrible thing he'd ever been part of. Beautiful because it represented the peak of human achievement, the culmination of our scientific and engineering capabilities. Terrible because it was built to destroy, and we were very, very good at using it for that purpose. He was proud of what we accomplished with the Liberty, but he was prouder of what we accomplished by giving it up. As the sun set over the shipyard, casting long shadows across the monument, Porter and Grant's granddaughter stood in companionable silence. Around them, the crowd began to disperse, dignitaries and officials returning to their various ships and responsibilities. But the two officers remained, paying their respects to a ship that had changed the course of history and to the people who had served aboard it. And at the base of the monument, a simple plaque bore the ship's motto, chosen by Admiral Hayes himself. It read, "Built for war, remembered for peace." The Liberty may have been outlawed, but it would never be forgotten. It stood as proof that sometimes the greatest strength isn't in destroying your enemies, but in choosing when not to. That sometimes winning means knowing when to put down your weapons and reach out your hand instead. That true power lies not in the ability to conquer, but in the wisdom to know when conquest would be the wrong choice. The Liberty story became a fundamental part of human identity, taught to every child from their earliest education. It represented the best of what humanity could be when pushed to the brink, the innovation and determination that could overcome seemingly impossible odds. But it also represented something more important, the wisdom to recognize when brute force wasn't the answer, when cooperation and diplomacy could achieve more than any weapon. In the end, the Liberty's greatest legacy wasn't the battles it won or the enemies it destroyed. It was the peace it made possible, the framework it created for a more stable galactic order, and the lesson it taught about the responsible use of power. The ship had been so overpowered that the galaxy had no choice but to outlaw it. But in doing so, the galaxy had learned something valuable about managing technological advancement and preventing arms races. The Liberty had forced the galactic community to confront uncomfortable questions about weapons development, military ethics, and the balance between security and stability. And humanity, the young species that had built this terrifying weapon and then voluntarily given it up, earned a respect that no amount of military conquest could have provided. They became known throughout the galaxy as a species of remarkable pragmatism, capable of great violence when necessary but wise enough to prefer peace. The Liberty had given them that reputation, and they wore it proudly, a reminder of who they had been and who they had chosen to become. The documentary, titled simply The Liberty Chronicles, became one of the most watched educational programs in galactic history. It featured interviews with surviving crew members, analysis from military experts, commentary from political scientists, and even candid discussions with former Valorian commanders who had faced the ship in battle. The program didn't glorify war or violence. Instead, it focused on the decisions that had been made, the alternatives that had been considered, and the ultimate choice to prioritize peace over continued military dominance. One particularly moving segment featured an interview with Commander Morris, Admiral Hayes's longtime aide and confidant. Now in her 90s and the last surviving member of Hayes's immediate staff, she shared insights into the Admiral's thinking during the critical period when the Liberty was being built and deployed. He used to say that every weapon carries a moral weight, Morris recounted, her voice soft but clear. The more powerful the weapon, the heavier that weight. He felt it every day. the responsibility of having created something that could kill on such a massive scale. When the opportunity came to dismantle the Liberty, I think part of him was relieved. Not because he regretted building it, we needed it to survive, but because he could finally set down that weight. The interview concluded with Morris reading from a private letter Hayes had written to her shortly before his death. "My greatest fear," he had written, "was that the Liberty would define humanity's future, that we would become known as the species who built super weapons and used them to dominate others. My greatest hope was that we would be remembered for our wisdom in giving up that power when we no longer needed it. I believe we chose the right path, even though it was the harder one. I pray that future generations will understand why we made the choices we did, and that they will have the courage to make similar choices if they're ever faced with such decisions." As humanity continued to expand across the stars, establishing new colonies, forging new alliances, and pushing the boundaries of scientific knowledge, the Liberty remained a touchstone for discussions about power and responsibility. When new weapons technologies were proposed, when military budgets were debated, when questions arose about how to balance security with stability, someone would inevitably invoke the Liberty's example. "What would Admiral Hayes do?" became a shorthand for asking whether a particular course of action served humanity's long-term interests or merely its short-term security. The monument at the shipyard became a pilgrimage site, visited by millions of beings from hundreds of species. They came to see the representation of the Liberty, to read the names of those who had served aboard it, to stand before the plaque with its simple motto, "Built for war, remembered for peace." Some came out of historical interest, others out of respect, still others seeking inspiration for their own struggles with questions of power and responsibility. And always at the base of the monument there were flowers. Fresh ones placed by visitors, wilted ones from previous pilgrims, a constant rotation of organic offerings that testified to the enduring power of the Liberty's story. No one coordinated the flower laying. No official ceremony demanded it. Yet the flowers were always there, a spontaneous expression of gratitude and remembrance from beings who understood that the Liberty's choice had made their own lives better, safer, more stable. The Liberty's story had no ending, because its influence continued to ripple through galactic society generation after generation. As long as beings remembered the ship, as long as they pondered the choices that had been made, as long as they struggled with questions of power and responsibility, the Liberty would remain relevant. The ship had been outlawed, yes, but its legacy was anything but prohibited. It was celebrated, studied, honored, and perpetuated, a permanent part of the galactic consciousness. And perhaps that was the ship's greatest victory after all. Not the battles it won or the enemies it defeated, but the lasting impact it had on how civilizations thought about power, about weapons, about the relationship between strength and wisdom. The Liberty had been so overpowered that the galaxy had no choice but to outlaw it. But in doing so, the galaxy had learned something invaluable, something that made all the difference in the millennia that followed. Sometimes the most powerful weapon isn't a gun or a bomb or even a planet-killing battleship. Sometimes the most powerful weapon is the wisdom to know when not to use the weapons you have. That was the Liberty's final lesson, and it was one the galaxy would never forget.